Welcome, everybody. Today we're going to be taking a look at our final topic of the year for grade 12 economics. And in particular, we're being looking at something very important, which we refer to in a broad sense as externalities or externality theory. We're going to see what externalities are in a few minutes, but just understand that this is a topic which looks a lot at individual economic decisions that occur between buyers and sellers and how they might impact society as a whole. It's a fairly important topic, particularly if you consider the connection between economics and other fields within the social studies. So, for example, environment or environmental studies, public policy studies, anything to do with the healthcare system, anything to do with just sort of overall government decisions. When you're looking at transactions in an economy, there's a lot of people who often have an interest in those transactions, and externality theory really gives you an idea of how those decisions impact not just the buyer or seller, but really a lot of different groups. We're only going to scratch the surface this week of exactly what externality theory involves and how it can be analyzed, but do understand that there's a lot more to it. And in fact, if you go on in economics and you start to specialize, particularly if you have a hybrid degree between economics and one of those other social science fields, it's very possible that you might start to look at this in a lot of detail. It's a growing and important area within the discipline. Part of our study today is going to reach back way far towards Unit 2, which we did in the first couple of months of the year. And in particular, we're going to talk a little bit about microeconomics again, and we're going to start to add in a few new ideas to that earlier discussion. One of the things that we saw in microeconomics, and we spent a lot of time looking at it, was that a lot of advocates for a free market like the idea of things like supply and demand determining prices because they believe that it's efficient. And the belief is that if you allow for a buyer and a seller to come together, and we're going to look at a graph just to illustrate this, and we allow for them to determine an outcome that will occur in terms of how many of a product might be sold and what price the product will sell at, that there's a natural balancing. The argument goes something like this. The market will determine an ideal or an efficient price and quantity because if the price or quantity that is suggested, let's say by a seller, and sellers choose the price they sell at in the free market, well, if it's not efficient, the buyer will let the seller know that there will be an imbalance between the supply and demand, and you will have either too many products, too few products, and a need to adjust. And so that in having this point that emerges over time where you have an equilibrium or an intersection point determining your price and your quantity, you're balancing the needs of those two parties and you're creating efficiency along the way. It makes a lot of sense. Okay, and certainly if you want to start going back to those concepts of consumer and producer surplus, deadweight loss, etc., you'll see that this is really, technically speaking, between those two parties, an efficient point for sale. The question, though, that I would ask is that, well, is this efficient from the perspective of all people? And is there perhaps a philosophy flaw or a flaw in the philosophy here in the argument that letting the market dictate what should happen is going to be in all people's best interest? If you consider who is actually benefiting from the sale of a product, you might start to realize that there's potentially some flaws. And in particular, one of the potential flaws is the fact that when you look at this model, it assumes that the only people really benefiting or gaining drawbacks are the seller or the purchaser of the product. But we all know that when people buy products in our society, while they directly benefit and while the company directly will also benefit as well, and that there's costs involved to both parties, there's other people who might be impacted by that sale. They may not participate, they may not really have a right to participate in the sale, but they certainly are going to be impacted by those products that are being purchased, and they may want to have some say as well. That's really where externality theory starts to come in. Okay, and as you might have guessed, and as we've been discussing, there are many situations where the costs and benefits that are associated with the supplier demand curve don't fully reflect the true cost or benefits that exist for all people within society. I might decide to, as an example, as a company, produce a product. I might decide that I'm going to be making furniture, but in making furniture, might make a lot of noise. I might create a little bit of an environmental disturbance. Those costs are not going to be costs that I have to pay for because they're not costs that are directly attributable to my balance book, but they are costs that somebody is facing in society, and they may not necessarily get represented within the sale. All production and all sales involve some aspect of these external costs, and as you're going to see, external benefits. And we have to, or at least we should, according to a lot of planners, take these into account when we're considering what's an ideal outcome, because the ideal outcome socially may not necessarily be exactly the same as the sort of outcome that emerges purely through the transaction between the buyer and the seller. What I'm going to do for the next few minutes is I'm going to look at external costs and external benefits that exist in a number of different industries, or at least potentially exist. And we're going to look a little bit at, well, is there an external cost? Is there external benefit to a traditional sale? We'll start with the beef market. Okay, we know that when you're looking at beef, there's a number of companies that are involved, and they also run large sort of slaughterhouses, and they'll have large production facilities. One of the companies in the United States that is well known to produce a lot of the beef that's sold throughout the country is IBP. And IBP is a company that produces a lot of beef at a fairly good or efficient rate and is able to give a reasonable cost to the consumer. The company, though, is also sometimes criticized by social critics because it causes the quality of beef to decrease, it creates a lower quality of beef, and also makes it hard for a lot of small farmers who may want to do things a little bit more independently to be able to make a go of things. If you were to believe that those social costs are significant and should be taken into account, then you would tend to argue that that's a notable external cost in this particular situation. A similar situation, which you might see when you're looking at something like beef production, is the fact that obviously producing beef means you have to have these I guess, factories. Obviously, these factories, they involve a certain amount of smell, a certain amount of noise. They're not really the most pleasant things to have in a neighborhood, especially if they're in a more urban type center. And certainly a lot of people may actually oppose their existence that aren't really directly purchasing the product and aren't directly selling the product, who may claim that this cost that exists to them should be taken into account by some party like the government. A famous example in Canada, and it's actually kind of an interesting one, if you know anything about Liberty Village in Toronto, for years it was a very industrial community, and it really was just an area where there was a lot of factories. As factories started to move overseas over the 1980s and the 1990s with the growth of globalization, Liberty Village kind of became a little bit of a rusted area, and eventually a lot of those factories slowly but surely gave way to a new type of use for the land, which was very popular, which was condos on the waterfront. One of the big debates, though, in the early 2000s, and really up until a few years ago when the company moved, was that there'd always been a company called Toronto Abattoirs, which was essentially a slaughterhouse. And a lot of the people buying those condos did not like the fact that the slaughterhouse was there because they claimed it created a smell, it created a noise, it contributed to sort of a production of meat that a lot of people who are maybe vegetarian or vegan didn't like. And a lot argued that it needs to go because of the fact that it was damaging their quality of life. Well, from the perspective of the abattoirs, they probably would have argued that that's a little silly because they'd been there for years beforehand and that the condo owners knew that when they moved in. But the other argument that they would make is that, well, we don't really have a duty to deal with smell and we don't really have a duty to deal with noise, because the reality is that those are social costs. They're not our individual costs, and they're not something that we're going to really pay a lot of money to deal with because it's not in our best interest. And so that would be a perfect example of a marginal external cost that at one point in time was quite notable. Another example where you may have marginal external costs or benefits, but in this particular case you would be dealing with benefits, involves the potential for having a sports arena in an area like Markham. If you don't know very much about the history of this particular debate, about 10 years ago, there was a lot of discussion about maybe putting a second team for the NHL or trying to get a second team for the NHL into the area north of Toronto. Markham and its city government had been proposing perhaps providing supports for the development through private interests of a local arena. One of the challenges, though, was that there were a lot of people both in favor and against that plan, and you had a lot of potential external costs or benefits. The cost, of course, would be the fact that it would be noisy. It would make the downtown a lot more rambunctious, particularly at night. It would create a lot of sort of nuisance for people who'd maybe lived in that area for a long time and didn't want their not rural, but suburban communities near the downtown to have their quality of life interfered with based on all those new people being pulled into the city center. On the other hand, there are also a number of external benefits. Why? Well, if you were a company that was, let's say, for example, running a restaurant or a bar and a new arena went in down the street, that couldn't help but be beneficial to your interests. And so there's a real tug of war between people who weren't actually participating within that sale. Some saying we really want it, others saying no, it's going to be an eyesore, it's poor for the community, we don't want it at all. Ultimately, the city council was a little bit split, but they voted against providing any support. And so there wasn't the development of the arena, but it just goes to show how that sale, which really independently would occur between, or the sale and building of arena would occur between landowners and a company building the land, also involved a lot of external cost and benefit in the equation. A third example where you see both potential for external costs and benefits would be the tar sands of Alberta. We know that the tar sands have a substantial external cost. That's obvious. If you go up there, there's a lot of environmental damage, a lot of pollution, and a lot of people would argue that the loss of quality of land and the risk to the water supply, the risk to the atmosphere, the company may not necessarily consider those, but perhaps they should. There's certainly a cost to the community. Now, on the other hand, if you're a person who lives in Fort McMurray, and you happen to own, let's say, for example, a hotel or any real business in that area, well, there's actually been a lot of spillover benefits as well, because of course, all of that new money, all of that new sort of investment and movement of people, either temporarily or on a permanent basis to a community, has created a lot of new potential customers that, I mean, the tar sand companies or the oil companies, they're not building to help that community out, but they're certainly going to indirectly help that community out. And so the external benefits would be there. The final example you might use would be a public park. Now, a public park, and we're going to get into this in a couple of days, it doesn't typically involve a cost, but there are actually what we would call external costs to using that free park. And certainly, some people would argue that maybe things like fees should exist in parks to discourage people from just brazenly abusing the quality of life for people in the park if they're using the park in negative ways. If you look at things like parks, every time a group of people that's rowdy and wants to drink or do different things within the park goes down there, then they actually create an external cost to another party. They may not be directly thinking about that because that cost doesn't exist to them, but it certainly would be there, and it certainly would be something that would have to be taken into account. Just on a sort of somewhat humorous personal anecdotal level, I was in the park just a couple of days ago. I was reading a book. I was enjoying myself quite a lot. An older gentleman with his wife decided to sit down and decided to pull out a boombox and started playing Akka, which is awful music from the 1990s. He was probably looking at that as a positive sort of experience for him. He might have even seen it as a positive externality from my perspective, because I was getting the blessing of being able to listen to his music, which wasn't there originally. But certainly from my perspective, I didn't see it as a marginal external benefit, but rather I saw it as an external cost, because of the fact that I was now being forced to endure something from his presence that wasn't there before he came. And of course, I gave up after about half an hour because it was just too much of a nuisance. And even as a free sitting or setting, I didn't want to be in that park anymore. As you can see, in each of the instances we've just looked at, there are many costs and benefits associated with production that don't exist for purely the buyer or the seller. And whenever you have those third parties, those other people who don't buy the product or who don't sell the product, but who are somehow gaining or losing from its sale, we call those things collectively externalities. There's two major types of externalities, and they both look at sort of the positive as well as the negative end of the equation. The first type is what we would refer to as a positive external or externality. Sometimes we also refer to those as spillover effects or neighborhood effects. Essentially, they involve a production wherein the company is not really considering the extra benefits of another party that gains from the sale. So if I'm a person who's building a library, or if I'm building a bookstore, I'm not going to build the bookstore to help all the local community out. I'm building the bookstore because I might sell products. That's the benefit to me that I consider. But I might actually indirectly help a number of local businesses, because that new store being there is going to pump their tires. To give you another example, if you're in a mall and you have a local sort of clothing store or whatever, well, if you put a major business that doesn't directly compete with you into that particular mall, sort of an anchor, you often see them on the ends of the mall, major new store, well, that's going to bring a lot of foot traffic, and that's going to benefit you. The new store is not going in to help the tenants of the mall out, but it may indirectly help them because now they're in a much more luxurious market than they've been before. So it's a positive spillover benefit. The term neighborhood effect essentially just means that the neighborhood benefits from the fact that the product is being sold. The other end of the spectrum, you have what we call negative externalities, and they exist when you have a transaction that takes place wherein the sale creates a cost that the company is not directly considering. It's a cost that somebody's boring or bearing, but not one that the company itself has to pay for. The classic example would be pollution. If I build a company that creates a lot of noise pollution, a lot of atmospheric or environmental pollution, those aren't costs that are on my book directly because I may not necessarily have to pay for the cleanup, but it certainly impacts the community, it certainly impacts the society around me, and it's a cost that probably in a lot of people's minds should be there, or at least that the company hopefully should be forced to bear by a group like the government. When you're looking at these sorts of situations, we can sometimes visualize how these extra costs might be taken into account and what would be maybe a more socially desirable outcome. One of the ways we can do that, and we'll start by looking at negative externalities, is to create what we call a marginal social cost curve. I'm going to show you a graph for this in a second, but what a marginal social cost curve is it's a model of what a cost curve would look like if a company didn't just consider its own cost that would exist on a ledger in terms of land, in terms of materials, labor, whatever, but also considered those costs that other people were bearing within the community as part of its own sort of cost projections. You can see how this works here with this particular graph. What you have is you have your normal marginal cost curve, or you can think of this like supply, and then you have what we call marginal social cost. And the idea would be that there's an additional cost that's not drawn in here. And I'm going to try to actually add it in with my pen. And hopefully this works this time. This additional cost is what we would call a marginal external cost. The company's not considering it, but if the company was forced to consider it, or if they were being a little bit more socially aware and they decided to include that on their cost and try to provide supports for those sorts of things, then you would add that marginal external cost to your original picture. You would add it in particular to the supply or your marginal cost curve, which was your private cost, and you would get what we would call the marginal social cost curve. And the marginal social cost curve is essentially equal to your private cost or your supply, but in addition, the social or public cost, which we call, and it's a little hard for me to write here, but which we call the marginal external cost, gets added as well. Okay, and so you can see that there. All right. Now, if we were to take that into account, we can see how this would look, and I'm going to go straight to this graph, but you can read that later if you want to. What would happen is that if you were to consider socially the ideal cost, or if society was selling this product and it was taking public costs into account, then rather than having supply and demand and the private situation determining the outcome of the market, where you'd have a price of 100 and a quantity that you can see there, what would occur is that the higher level of cost would be taken into account with the sale. The price of the product would be a bit higher, and the quantity being sold that's efficient from a social perspective would be a bit lower. Will this occur on its own? No, because the company is not going to just consider the third parties in the market and try to benefit the community by adding their costs onto its ledgers. It's not the way the world works. But were the government to actually sell the product and consider those third parties as part of the cost, in addition to the traditional measures in terms of labor, materials, etc., then you would end up seeing that particular outcome. Now, a question, could you ever force a company to consider those costs? Would there be a way of taking what's external and actually making it internal? Well, sure, of course. You could do things like, for example, a carbon tax. You could do things where a company has to pay a penalty for whatever, negative things that they're creating for the community. That would essentially take the external and put it onto the shoulders of the company and make it internal, but it would require the arm or the influence of a government in order for it to occur. And sometimes governments will step in. Things like carbon taxes are becoming more common as a means of trying to blend those social costs into the equation, but they're always controversial because you can probably imagine things like pollution, they're not easily quantifiable, and there's going to be a lot of debate in terms of exactly who is facing these costs, what are the level of those costs, and what kind of burden should a company ever be forced to bear, or should they be forced to bear in the first place. Now, final thing that we'll look at in this particular lesson is we'll look a little bit at the marginal social benefit curve. Here you can see this here. Essentially what this is it's looking at how socially you may take into account the public benefits that occur from a private sale, and what would happen if the government were to sell the product, let's say hypothetically, or society were to sell the product, and they wouldn't just consider the benefit to the company, but also the other individuals within the land or within the community. It's the same sort of idea as what we saw before. You have a normal sale point, which the private market would dictate, where demand and supply determine the price of the product. But if you add the extra benefits, so you're adding them onto the company's benefits or the demand, then that would give you a higher level of potential benefits that society might consider if it was selling the product. And that would end up meaning that if you were to balance those out, the idea would actually be to sell at a higher price and to sell more of that particular product. Now, will that occur on its own? No. No company is going to sell more of a product in order to help its neighbors out. But if the government wanted them to sell more, or if it wanted to encourage more sales of a socially sort of desirable product, then there is a way that they could encourage that, and that would be by actually adding in what we might call a subsidy. And essentially, the government may tell a company, we'll give you some money, we'll encourage you to sell more, and if we give you that extra money, hopefully that extra money will allow for you to sell at a higher price, but also sell more of the product in order to encourage the public to want it. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. A little bit of a longer lesson here, but it goes over exactly what externalities are and how they work. You have a pretty straightforward assignment for today. I'd like you to take a look at pages 362 to 363 in your textbook, and then try to answer questions 1 to 3. There's also 4 questions at the end of the notes package from today's class, which involves some graphs for externalities, and I want you to sort of adjust market based on what externalities might exist. Try to finish those as well. We'll talk about them together as a group when you come back next day.